Haida herself was still very new to Islam. Still, he was already at home in the Islamic community of our city. She used to do everything with heart and dedication. It was already being considered as a teacher for an Islamic school. On the way to she told me what to expect. The group consists of approximately 30 women from German and Turkish origin. They meet once a time week on the premises of a Turkish Islamic organization. The leader of the group, Maryam, is a German Muslim about 50 years old. He lived for a few years with the husband in Turkey, where they both participated in many Islamic activities. Maryam, who is now a widow, engages in Islamic activities in Germany as well. Gives lectured on Islamic topics and founded this women's group. During the Maryam would give a class on Islam and then the women who wanted to would stay a little longer for a chat. We bring tea and cake. This week was the cake, it was Haida's responsibility. It took time in the oven and Haida was a little late. By this was running. Maryam is not at all pleased with people coming in late. Unfortunately, we were unable to park near the building. So Haida simply drove to the courtyard. We were lucky. One of the cars parked was about to leave and a friendly Turkish-looking man signaled down to help us get the car into that free space. The crowd was fascinating too. Is everyone going to the date? Haida laughed. That would be great. Clear that not everyone was going to the meeting. Haida explained to me that every end of week the place was crowded, as the Turkish organization held its own activities. The German-speaking meeting was held in one part separate from the building. When we entered the hall, we were greeted in a tumultuous way. "Hi, Khadija. How are you today? Oh, you brought one of your delicious cakes? The others are in the kitchen. Maria, the class is about to start. Women with covered hair and long dresses have passed by us. And I heard several times the Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum. That may God's peace be with you." I was included in the friendly welcome and kissed at the cheeks. Guests are welcome. Women, they thought it was great that someone dared to enter the lion's den to see for on his own as the Muslims were. This meeting seemed not to be just for Muslim women speaking German, but also a contact group for women interested in Islam. It seemed to be in the right place. We really were late. The class started immediately. Haida Khadija put the cake in the kitchen and then we enter the lecture hall. The long room was covered with gray carpet. There was no furniture, just a small shelf on the wall. The women were sitting in a circle on the floor, had left their shoes outside, as is customary in mosques and Muslim homes. Maryam, the leader of the group, had placed several books in front of her. She was a burly woman with bright and friendly blue eyes and a simple white scarf. That day she had talked about the continuity of history as documented in the Quran. About different prophets and that they all brought the same message. The class is not it contained a lot of news for me. Islam recognizes most of the prophets of the Old and New Testaments. Some of the details of the stories differed, but the basic thinking is always the same. God sends prophets to remember the people of his message. More interesting to me than the class were the listeners, who were more or less concentrated, followed the class. It is not surprising that God's message is always forgotten. For some women the information seemed to be new. What me surprised. In the Quran there is a chapter that places the stories of the prophets in a general context. Who knows which chapter I'm talking about? Had women of all ages, many of German origin, some Turkish girls, obviously still in school, they whispered in each other's ears and they kept going in and out of the room. This distracted Maryam and then she said, "If they don't want to listen, stay outside." All the women were covered. They wore scarves in all colors and nuances, simply tied or wrapped elaborately or decorated with bows. Some pulled the handkerchief to the forehead. Others showed their hair. Whenever people had problems, they would go back to God, and then they thought they didn't need Him anymore. Some women brought small children. One discovered the light switch as a funny game, and I didn't want to play with anything else. Please, can someone move the child away from the light switch? Finally, the mother took the child, who protested loudly, to the kitchen, where he discovered the cake and got busy for at least 15 minutes. But when there were calls to several women and a Turkish girl wanted to know how many cups of tea and coffee she should prepare and how long it would take for us to finish, was enough for Maryam. We will continue from here next week, and now we will have tea. So I finally had a chance to talk to the women. Immediately me welcomed. After all, we're all sisters. Do you drink tea or coffee? There's cake. So, did you like it? Soon we were in the middle of a lively conversation. Clear they all wanted to know who I was and what had brought me to an Islamic meeting. Maryam talked about how long it had taken for her faith to grow. But I have never regretted my decision for Islam. Haida Khadija, on the other hand, she didn't know much about Islam when she became a Muslim. But, to this day, I've only been surprised in a positive way. What attracted her was the way of healthy Islamic life, abstinence from all kinds of drugs, prayer and fasting as an exercise for the body, mind and soul, hygienic commandments. All of this made sense to her, as a biology and sports teacher. Maryam confirmed that the regular prayers had been very well for her back. And then he talked about the time in Turkey and tried to explain to me Turkish history. A subject about which I still don't know much about. At that time I was totally lost. I met a lot of women. And they all told me their personal stories about how they came to Islam. Hamida befriended a Turkish couple after divorce and in this way came to know and love Islam. The 15-year-old daughter, Nina, had maintained the Christian religion, although she was not practitioner. She had accompanied her mother to the meeting. Fatima Elizabeth, with her early 20s, studying to become a teacher, a few years ago worked in a temporary job. He had worked in a factory next to side with a German Muslim woman. Fatima Elizabeth's family was Catholic and both parents were religious teachers. They were very shocked when they learned that their daughter had embraced Islam. The shock had passed in the last few years, and with goodwill on both sides, life worked well. The friend of Fatima Elizabeth, Sabine, who came to Islam through her husband, was not so lucky. The father, he kicked him out of the house because of the handkerchief. There were mothers, maids, students, a secretary and a dental lab assistant. The women were single, married, divorced. Husbands, if they existed, they came from Turkey, Lebanon, Yemen, Morocco and other countries. Some women, they had adopted an Islamic name, others had not. In fact, women only had one thing in common. And it was religion, Islam. But this seemed to accomplish them, yes, be the guiding principle in their lives. Islam is the framework in which we live. That day I learned two things. I found that the framework that Islam lays out is not so restricted as I expected. There is no standardized Muslim. A Muslim is just a person who makes a decision for God. These women had embraced the Islam, but they continued to be themselves. Second, I realized for the first time a time that never stops learning. Now I had found these women who they were so devoted, even though they didn't know everything there is to know. Knowledge is not everything. The important thing is to have a firm belief. We created man and we know what his soul confides to him, because we are closer to him than his jugular artery. Quran 50-16. A few weeks later I made my personal decision for God and Islam. After 2.5 years of learning, I embraced Islam. What finally led me to this stage was the thought, if I were to die now and present myself before God, as explained to him why I didn't become a Muslim? When I couldn't more to come up with a reasonable answer, I decided on the only logical thing to do and I testified. There is no God except Allah and Muhammad is his messenger.